He stared at his reflection in the old mirror and didn't recognize the man staring back. Disheveled hair, wild eyes, blood on his forehead. Somewhere in the darkness of a dead woman's apartment, a killer was waiting. The chemist, the one who poisoned the water. He could feel the poison spreading through his veins, his fingers going numb, strength draining away. A few more minutes, and it would all be over. He pressed his palm against the cold glass. The reflection mirrored the gesture. And then he understood the most terrifying thing. The killer wasn't hiding in the darkness. The killer was staring at him from the mirror. Because the chemist had never existed. Ethan Hayes stepped out of his silver sedan and double-clicked the key fob. The car's hazard lights flashed, confirming it was locked. The November air in New York was thick with the smell of dampness, exhaust fumes, and something sour. The scent of a city shedding its leaves into storm drains. He winced. Disorder. Organic matter decomposing in the wrong places, sullying the clean lines of the asphalt. The building before him was a pre-war classic, a 7-story red brick structure with massive columns flanking the entrance. A fine web of cracks covered the facade, but the building itself stood firm, a solid piece of real estate. Ethan automatically calculated the square footage, the state of the foundation, the potential price per square foot in this part of the city. The numbers settled into a satisfying sum in his head. The entryway greeted him with peeling green paint and a thick, cloying aroma of old stew, mingled with dust and stale tobacco smoke. Ethan ascended the stairs, keeping a safe distance from the grimy banister. The steps groaned under his polished Oxfords. On the 4th floor, he stopped in front of apartment number 72. He pulled out the set of keys he'd received from the lawyer and inserted one into the lock. The mechanism turned with a dry click. The door swung open into silence. It wasn't just the absence of sound, but something deeper. A vacuum. Ethan crossed the threshold, and the air inside felt different. Thinner, devoid of the scent of life. Instead of the musty odor of old age he had expected, he was met with a chemical sharpness. Cleaning agents. Bleach. The sterility of a laboratory, not the home of a 78-year-old woman. He closed the door behind him and took in his surroundings. The entryway was a narrow corridor that led deeper into the apartment. Dim light spilled from a distant room. To his left hung a large mirror in a heavy, time-darkened frame. To his right, a coat rack stood empty, save for a single black trench coat hanging from a hook, like a forgotten shadow. The place felt preserved, almost like a museum exhibit. Ethan took a step forward. The parquet floor beneath his feet didn't creak. Perfect condition. He ran his eyes along the walls. No cracks, the wallpaper smooth and unblemished. His professional mind began composing its report. Property in excellent condition, approximately 800 square feet, high ceilings, pre-war layout, no visible defects. Forecast, quick sale, high margin. A cold satisfaction spread through his chest. This was going to be easy. He walked into the living room. It was spacious, bathed in the murky light of the November day filtering through a large window. The furniture was old, from another era, but impeccably maintained. A bookshelf lined one wall, each volume standing spine out, perfectly aligned. Not a single speck of dust on the coffee table. A sofa, upholstered in faded fabric, and a stepladder. Ethan stopped. An aluminum stepladder stood open in the middle of the room, directly beneath a massive crystal chandelier. According to the police report the lawyer had given him, Eleanor Vance had fallen from this very ladder while changing a light bulb. Broken neck, instantaneous death. He tilted his head, his appraiser's gaze, trained to find inconsistencies, activating automatically. He moved closer and crouched down, squinting. The rungs of the ladder were coated in a fine, even layer of dust. If someone had climbed it, the dust would have been disturbed by their hands and shoes. He ran a finger along the bottom step. A gray film transferred to his skin. Untouched. He shifted his gaze to the polished hardwood floor beneath the ladder. Not a single scratch. No mark from a falling body or the shifting of metal feet. Lifting his head, he examined the chandelier. Every single bulb was intact. His internal report updated itself. Official findings do not align with physical evidence. Scene has been staged. Motive for staging, unknown. Further analysis required. A prickle of irritation shot through him. An illogical detail. A variable that didn't fit the equation. He hated loose ends. They turned a simple problem into a puzzle. He straightened up, his eyes slowly scanning the room again. His attention was caught by a chair near the window. It was an old Viennese armchair with curved legs and worn upholstery. The seat was polished to a shine, as if someone had sat there for decades, day after day, hour after hour. The chair was angled toward the window, positioned perfectly for observing the entire courtyard down below. On the wide windowsill, lying in a strip of gray daylight, was a thin notebook. Ethan frowned as he approached it. The notebook seemed conspicuously placed, as if it had been left there for him to find. It had a cheap cardboard cover the color of faded ochre. He picked it up. The cover felt warm from the faint sunlight. On it, in a neat, almost calligraphic script, was a single word. Observations. Ethan paused, staring at the title. Something about that word, in that precise handwriting, sparked a flicker of recognition. It felt professional, methodical. He slowly opened the notebook. The first page read, September 1st, sunrise 6:14:32, sunset 19:47:18, pressure 1013 millibars, moon phase waning 23%, temperature 57 degrees Fahrenheit, humidity 68%. He mentally converted the Celsius reading, a force of habit. He turned the page. September 2nd, sunrise 6:16:01, sunset 19:44:52, pressure 1011 millibars, moon phase waning 21%, temperature 55 degrees Fahrenheit, humidity 71%. He flipped through several more pages. Each entry was identical in its structure, not a single mistake or correction. The numbers were arranged in flawless columns, as if printed from a machine. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly. Method. System. Order. He couldn't help but feel a certain respect for the author of these notes. A 78-year-old woman maintaining a meteorological diary with the precision of a scientist. No missed days, no emotion. Just pure, unadulterated analysis. It was captivating. He sank into the Viennese armchair, the wood groaning softly under his weight, and continued to flip through the pages. The weather entries ended on page 30. The 31st page opened with a new heading. Subject, The Chemist, Apartment 74. Ethan froze, his fingers stiffening on the edge of the page. The word subject. It struck a nerve. He used that word himself hundreds of times when describing properties. Subject of appraisal. Subject of analysis. But this wasn't about an apartment. He read the first entry. September 10th, 0742. Subject left the apartment. Gray coat, black briefcase. Gait is steady. Stride length 27 to 28 inches. Direction, courtyard archway toward the street. Time to reach archway, 47 seconds. Ethan exhaled slowly. 1834, subject returned. Same coat, briefcase in right hand. Face shows signs of fatigue. paused at mailboxes for 1 minute 12 seconds before proceeding upstairs. He turned the page. September 12th, 21:15. Subject took out the trash. White bag approximately 4 gallons. Contents, visual analysis. Container from frozen dumplings. Empty half-liter bottle of vodka. Pharmacy receipt. The next entry. September 14th, 08:30. Subject smoking near the entrance. Unfiltered cigarettes. 3 cigarettes in 11 minutes. Tapping fingers nervously on the pack. Possible cause, work-related stress or personal issues. A chill crept slowly up Ethan's spine. This wasn't just observation. It was a dossier. He flipped further. The entries became more detailed. An analysis of purchases based on receipts retrieved from the trash. A medication schedule reconstructed from empty blister packs. Laundry frequency determined by the appearance of clothes on a balcony. Social contacts logged by the number of visitors. The chemist had been disassembled into his component parts, like a machine. Every detail was described, every habit recorded. Methodical. Emotionless. It was his own appraisal methodology, applied not to a building, but to a human being. Ethan's grip tightened on the notebook, the paper crackling under his fingers. He couldn't stop reading. The diary had become a trap, pulling him deeper with every page. The entries spanned weeks. September. October. The level of detail was staggering. Eleanor Vance had been constructing a psychological profile of her subject based on microscopic observations. She knew everything about the chemist. His fears, his weaknesses, his patterns. Ethan finally reached the last written page. The handwriting here was different. The letters trembled. The lines were broken. The hand that wrote them had been weak, but the mind behind it remained clear. The entry was dated the previous day. The experiment has spun out of control. The reagents are unstable. Forecast, tonight at 10 p.m. Ethan stared at the line. Yesterday, the day Eleanor Vance died. A forecast for 10 p.m. What was supposed to happen? He turned the page. It was blank. The end of the diary. The silence in the apartment grew denser, almost tangible. Ethan slowly lifted his gaze from the notebook and looked out the window. The building opposite stood 100 feet away, another pre-war giant. Its rows of dark windows stared back at him like empty eye sockets. One of them belonged to apartment 74, to the chemist. He swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. Logic dictated his next move. Close the book, leave the apartment, hand the information to the police, and forget about it. But his professional instinct, honed to find the truth beneath layers of deception, rebelled. The equation was unsolved. The puzzle was incomplete. A forecast for 10 p.m. Today was November 8th. Had the forecast failed? Or had it come true in a way he couldn't see? Ethan pulled his smartphone from his pocket, its screen glowing with a bluish light. He opened his contacts and found his assistant's number. Kevin answered on the second ring. "Ethan? Is everything okay?" "Kevin." Ethan's voice was steady, businesslike. "Cancel all my meetings for today." "All of them? But you have that presentation at 6. "All of them," Ethan repeated. "Unforeseen circumstances have come up at the property. They require further analysis." "Understood. Anything serious?" "Discrepancies in the paperwork. I'll sort it out." He hung up without waiting for a reply. The decision was made. The rationalization of his irrational impulse was complete. He would stay. He would wait for 10 p.m. He would test the dead woman's forecast. He leaned back in the chair and placed the notebook in his lap. At that exact moment, a sound tore through the apartment's silence. A bang. Sharp, loud, like a gunshot. Ethan leaped to his feet, his heart plummeting. The notebook tumbled from his hands and slapped against the floor. The door to the bedroom, which had been slightly ajar, was now firmly shut. He froze, staring at it, his breathing quickening. The apartment had acted. It had responded. The atmosphere was no longer passive. It had become hostile. Ethan forced himself to take a breath. Slow. Controlled. "A draft," he said aloud, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the dead silence. "Just a draft in an old building." He took a step toward the door, then another. Each movement was an attempt to reclaim control, to prove to himself that he was in charge of the situation. The floorboards creaked under his shoe. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold brass of the doorknob. He pressed down. The mechanism inside clicked, and the knob turned all the way. But the door didn't budge. Ethan frowned and pushed. Nothing. He tried again, slower this time, putting his weight into it. The door was solid, immovable. He took a step back, staring at the smooth surface of the old wood. His mind raced, desperately searching for a logical explanation. Had the lock jammed? But the mechanism had worked. Had the door swollen with moisture? The air in the apartment was bone dry. A warped frame? The building was nearly a century old. It was possible. Logical theories formed one after another, but none felt sufficient. Ethan clenched his jaw. He took another step back, turned sideways, and slammed his shoulder into the door, aiming for the area around the lock. The impact was a dull thud, and a sharp pain shot through his shoulder. The door didn't even vibrate. He hit it again, harder this time, putting his full body weight behind the blow. The wood absorbed the impact without a sound. He stumbled back, breathing heavily. His heart hammered against his ribs, and sweat beaded on his forehead. He stared at the door. An ordinary fixture had transformed into an impenetrable, mocking barrier. Physical force was useless. Logic was failing. He slowly straightened up, listening to his own ragged breathing. The silence pressed in on his eardrums. And then, through the fog of adrenaline, his mind produced the only explanation that fit all the facts. The door wasn't jammed. It had been locked. With a key. From the inside. From an empty room. A deep, paralyzing cold seeped into his veins. He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping across the apartment. The long hallway. The dark mirror. The living room bathed in gray light. The draft was no longer a coincidence. He was no longer an appraiser studying a property. He had become the exhibit, trapped in someone else's insane experiment. The chill spread through him in waves, starting at the back of his neck and crawling down his spine. His heart was a frantic bird beating against his throat, the pulse throbbing in his temples. His palms were instantly slick with sweat. Trapped. He was locked in a dead woman's apartment. His first impulse was primal, irrational. Break down the door, smash a window, run. The instinct for self-preservation screamed for action, any action, to escape this cage. He took 2 steps back from the door and squeezed his eyes shut. 3 deep, ragged breaths. The air burned his lungs as if it were laced with acid. Panic was chaos. Chaos was the death of control. And control was the only thing he had left. He forced his mind to work, to break the problem down into its component parts. Problem: the door is locked. Solution: find the key. Variable: time. Resources: the accessible areas of the apartment. Method: a systematic search. Ethan opened his eyes. His breathing evened out. His pulse slowed from a frantic gallop to a manageable, pounding rhythm. He had transformed the threat into a task, and tasks could be solved. He turned and walked back into the living room, his stride now confident and purposeful. Each step was a reclamation of power over his circumstances. He started with the writing desk against the wall. The top drawer slid open silently on well-oiled runners. Inside, office supplies were arranged with geometric precision. Pencils lay parallel to one another, sharpened to identical lengths. Pens, black and blue, were separated into compartments. Paper clips were sorted by size in a small box. Not a single key. The second drawer held stationery, envelopes, and stamps, all new and untouched. Ethan slid his hand along the bottom, checking for a false panel. Nothing. The third drawer was locked. He pulled harder, but the lock held fast. The irony hit him like a punch to the gut. He was looking for a key to one door, only to be thwarted by another locked drawer. He straightened up, his eyes scanning the room. The bookshelf, the sofa, the coffee table, the Viennese armchair by the window, the hallway. He walked into the narrow corridor. To his left, the mirror in its dark frame reflected his pale, tense face. To his right, the coat rack with its single occupant, the black coat. He lifted it from the hook. The fabric was heavy, high quality, an old military-style wool coat. He plunged his hands into the pockets. The right held an empty, neatly folded handkerchief. The left was empty. The inside pocket, empty. Ethan threw the coat back onto the hook with more force than necessary. He checked a narrow shoe cabinet. 3 pairs of shoes, polished to a mirror shine, were arranged with their toes pointing out. No keys. He rapped his knuckles along the walls of the hallway, listening for a change in sound. The thick, pre-war walls answered with a dull, uniform thud. No hidden safes. Time was slipping away. He returned to the living room and stood in the center, slowly turning on the spot. His gaze landed on an old chest of drawers against the opposite wall. It was a massive piece of dark wood with 3 wide drawers. He walked over and opened the top one. Linens. White sheets, starched and folded with perfect precision. He ran his hand under the stack, feeling the cool, smooth wood of the drawer's bottom. Empty. The second drawer held more linens. Pillowcases, duvet covers. The third and bottom drawer was stiff, opening with a groan. Inside lay a tin box. It was rectangular and flat, with a faded image of flowers on the lid. An old biscuit tin, the kind you'd find in a grandmother's pantry. He pulled it out and set it on top of the dresser. The lid opened with a faint squeal. Inside was chaos. Buttons. Hundreds of buttons of all sizes and colors, needles stuck into a ball of yarn, spools of thread, thimbles, scraps of fabric. A lifetime of sewing detritus. Disorder in the house of order. Ethan frowned. This didn't fit the image of Eleanor Vance. The methodical woman who arranged her pencils like soldiers wouldn't keep such a mess. Unless it was camouflage. He plunged his hand into the sea of buttons, feeling the cool plastic and smooth mother-of-pearl slip between his fingers. He dug deeper. His fingertips brushed against something heavy and metallic. He tipped the contents of the box onto the top of the dresser, buttons scattered in every direction, some clattering to the floor. Lying on the dark wood was a ring of keys. They were heavy and rusted. About 10 of them, all mismatched and ancient, bound together by a worn leather cord. Bronze, steel, one even copper, in various shapes and sizes. Hope flared in his chest, sharp and painful. He snatched the ring and hurried back to the locked bedroom door. The dim light from the living room barely reached it. He knelt before the keyhole, holding the keys up to his eyes. The first key was large and bronze, with an ornate head. He inserted it into the keyhole. It went in stiffly, metal scraping against metal. He tried to turn it. It wouldn't give. He pulled it out and set it aside. The second was small and steel. It was too thin for the keyhole and didn't even go in. The third, medium-sized, with a square head, went in halfway and got stuck. He pulled it out with effort, scraping his knuckles on the doorframe. "Damn it," he muttered. The fourth key fit. He turned it, putting his strength into it. The metal resisted. He pushed harder, his fingernail pressing against the head of the key. A crack. A sharp pain shot through his finger. The nail had split down to the quick, and a thin line of blood welled up. "Damn it!" he said again, louder this time, his voice laced with anger. He snatched his hand back, pressing the injured finger to his lips. The metallic taste of blood mingled with adrenaline. He was breathing heavily, glaring at the door. A hot, uncontrollable anger was rising within him. The first serious crack had appeared in his armor of self-control. The ring of keys slipped from his damp fingers and fell to the floor with a loud jangle. The sound was deafening in the dead silence of the apartment. Ethan flinched and froze. The echo died. The silence returned, thicker than before. He bent down slowly, fumbling for the keys in the dim light. His fingers found the cold metal. 5 keys tried. 5 failures. 5 more to go. He forced himself to even his breathing. Panic had no place here. This was a task, a process of elimination. Sooner or later, one had to work. The 6th key was massive, clearly for an exterior door. Too big. The 7th looked like the 4th, but slightly shorter. It went into the lock, turned a third of the way, and stopped. The 8th was long and narrow, for a mailbox or a cabinet. Useless. The 9th was an old, skeletal key with a simple circular head. He had almost no hope left as he slid it into the keyhole. It went in smoothly, without resistance. He held his breath. Slowly he turned it. A click. A loud, dry, metallic click as the lock's mechanism turned over. The sound echoed through the apartment. He froze, disbelieving. It had opened. Triumph washed over him in a wave, cleansing him of fear and anger. He had won. He was in control again. Logic had prevailed over chaos. He rose to his feet, brushed off the knees of his trousers, and placed his hand on the cold doorknob. He pressed down. The door opened inward slowly, with a soft creak of its hinges. And the blast of cold wind hit him in the face. A blast of November air, damp and smelling of wet concrete and exhaust, hit him. Ethan recoiled instinctively. The bedroom was drowning in twilight, the last remnants of daylight reflecting off the overcast sky, barely illuminating the room. A white curtain thrashed wildly in the draft, slapping against the windowsill. The window was wide open. Ethan froze on the threshold, staring at the open frame. Impossible. He distinctly remembered his initial survey of the apartment. Every window had been sealed shut. He would have noticed a draft in the sterile, hermetic atmosphere of this place. He couldn't have been mistaken, but the window was open, which meant someone had opened it. The thought pierced his consciousness like a shard of ice. Someone had been here. While he was fumbling with the keys, while he was struggling with the lock, someone had slipped past him, silent and unseen, and thrown open the window. Or they had been here from the beginning, locked themselves in the bedroom, waited for him to find the key, and then escaped through the window. But this was the 4th floor. It was suicide. Ethan stepped cautiously into the room, his feet moving slowly as if on a minefield. Each step echoed dully in the empty space. The bedroom was ascetic to the extreme. An iron bed against the wall, covered with a faded spread, not a single wrinkle. The pillow was fluffed and centered. No one had slept in this bed for a very long time. A massive two-door wardrobe made of dark wood. Nothing else. No pictures, no photographs, no personal belongings. It was less a room and more a cell. He walked to the window. The wind whipped through his hair, carrying the distant sounds of city traffic and a child's shout from the courtyard below. He looked down. 4 stories. The asphalt seemed distant and unforgiving. Below the window, there was nothing. No ledge, no balcony, no fire escape. Jumping was impossible. Climbing down was impossible. Then why open the window? To let someone in? Or something out? Paranoia crawled over his skin like ants. He spun around, his eyes darting around the room. The wardrobe. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and threw open the doors. Inside hung old clothes, dark dresses, blouses, skirts, all neat, arranged by color. The smell of mothballs hit him. He ran his hands between the hangers, parting the fabric. Empty. He knelt and looked under the bed. No dust. The floor was clean. The space beneath the bed was completely bare. No one. No trace of anyone. But the absence of evidence was more terrifying than any clue. It implied professionalism, caution, the ability to move without a sound, to leave no prints. Someone invisible had been here, and had vanished, leaving only the cold wind as a taunting message. Ethan stood up, his heart pounding again, his breathing shallow. He quickly exited the bedroom, slammed the door shut, and turned the key in the lock. A solid click. Locked. He had locked the monster out. Or had he locked himself in with it? He returned to the living room, the apartment's only source of light. November twilight was thickening outside, turning the courtyard into a gray smudge. His sense of triumph had completely evaporated, replaced by a sticky, suffocating feeling of another's presence. Someone was watching. He raised his left wrist and glanced at his watch. 9:45 p.m. 15 minutes until the appointed hour. Until 10 p.m., when, according to Eleanor Vance's final entry, something was supposed to happen. The experiment has spun out of control. The reagents are unstable. Forecast. Tonight at 10 p.m. Despite the terror, despite the paranoia, his original mission remained. He had to see it through. He had to understand. It was the only way to regain control, to turn the irrational into the rational, chaos into a system. He slowly sank back into the Viennese armchair by the window. The seat creaked under his weight. The worn upholstery felt warm, as if someone had just left it. He turned to face the window. The building opposite was a gray monolith, its rows of dark windows like empty eye sockets in the deepening dusk. Apartment 74. The chemist's apartment. He recalled the notes from the diary. 3rd floor, slightly left of center. He began counting the windows, squinting in the dim light. 1st, 2nd, 3rd floor. Windows from left to right. 1, 2, 3. There. The window was dark, covered by a heavy curtain. No light, no movement. He forced himself to focus, to push aside the fear, to become the cold observer that Eleanor Vance had been. He was the hunter, waiting for his prey. The minutes crawled by. The silence of the apartment was a physical pressure, broken only by the ticking of an unseen clock somewhere in the depths of the room. He didn't move, his gaze locked on the dark window across the way. 9:50. 9:55. His breathing slowed, his pulse evened out. He entered a state of absolute concentration. He was ready. His phone lay in his jacket pocket, screen up. One quick movement was all it would take to start recording. He would catch the Chemist. He would find a rational explanation. He would prove that the world still operated under a set of rules. As 10 p.m. approached, he stared, unblinking, at the window. And then, in his peripheral vision, he caught a flicker of movement. Not in the target window. Higher. A floor above, and slightly to the right. He shifted his gaze. The window was dark, empty. Had he imagined it? He was about to return his focus to apartment 74 when a brief, faint glint of light flashed in the upper window, like a reflection off glass, or a lens. He tensed, peering into the darkness. A second passed. 2. And then he saw it. A silhouette was taking shape in the depths of the dark window. A person, standing perfectly still, raising something to their face. Another glint, short, barely perceptible. A reflection off an optic. Binoculars. Someone was watching him. Directly at him. Ice flooded his veins, paralyzing him. He sat frozen, unable to tear his gaze from the dark figure in the window opposite. The figure didn't move. It just stood there and watched. The hunter and the prey had switched roles. The fear should have been crippling. Instead, it burned through the oxygen in his blood, converting it into pure fuel for his mind. Someone was watching him with binoculars. Fine. The threat was no longer a phantom dissolved in the air of this damned apartment. It had a shape, coordinates, a location. 5th floor, a window to the right of center. The observed had become the observer. But now Ethan could see him. This could be documented, analyzed, understood. His fingers tightened on the arms of the chair, the wood groaning under the pressure. "It's a 2-player game now," he whispered into the void. His mind shifted into the gear he used for complex negotiations. Cold calculation over emotion. Strategy over panic. He now had 2 subjects. First, apartment 74, 3rd floor. The Chemist, from Eleanor Vance's notebook. A dark window behind a heavy curtain. Second, the apartment on the 5th floor, to the right. An unknown observer with binoculars. This was a system, and Ethan knew how to read systems. He rose slowly from the chair, forcing his movements to be smooth, natural. The silhouette in the upper window remained motionless. He turned his back to it, as if losing interest, and walked casually to the coffee table. His smartphone lay face down on the polished surface. He picked it up and checked the battery. 82%. Enough to record for an hour if needed. He opened the camera app, switched to video, and engaged the maximum digital zoom. The quality would be grainy, but he'd be able to make out the details. A clear plan was forming. When the event occurred in the Chemist's window, and it would happen at exactly 10 p.m., according to the notebook, he would start recording. He would capture what happened in both windows simultaneously. He would gather data. Data meant facts. Facts meant control. A false sense of confidence, warm and deceptive, spread through him. He allowed himself to believe in it. The alternative, surrendering to irrational terror, was unacceptable. He sat back down in the chair, placing the phone screen up on his lap. His gaze returned to the windows opposite. The silhouette with the binoculars was still there, unnervingly still. He realized he hadn't seen the figure shift its posture, lower its arms, or step away from the window even once. It stood there like a statue, like a mannequin, or like something waiting. The psychological pressure mounted. The inability to see the observer's face made them feel inhuman, a faceless threat suspended over him. Ethan swallowed, his throat suddenly parched. His saliva was thick, his tongue sticking to the roof of his mouth. Stress. Adrenaline. His body was preparing for fight or flight, diverting resources from non-essential functions. He needed water. Ethan stood, phone in hand. He couldn't let the observer see his fear. His movements were calm, deliberate. Just a man getting a drink of water. The small kitchen greeted him with the same sterile emptiness. The counters were clean, the sink dry. On a small table, in the dim light from the window, sat a single glass. He walked to the sink and turned the faucet. Water rushed out with a soft hiss. He held the glass under the stream. It was cold, almost icy. He brought the glass to his lips and took a long, greedy gulp. The water soothed his raw throat, a refreshing coolness spreading through him. He drank more, draining the glass almost completely. The physical relief was immediate. He set the glass down on the edge of the sink and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. A second of normalcy. A second where he was just a man in a strange apartment, not a pawn in some twisted game. He returned to the living room, sat down, and glanced at his watch. 9:59:47, 13 seconds. His breathing slowed. His pulse steadied. He raised his phone, aiming the camera at the building opposite, framing both the chemist's and the observer's windows. His thumb hovered over the record button. 10 seconds. 5. 10 minutes. At that exact moment, with a chilling, inhuman precision, a light flared on in the window of apartment 74. It wasn't the warm, yellow glow of an incandescent bulb. It was a cold, bluish, fluorescent light that didn't gradually fill the room, but simply appeared, instant and stark. The heavy curtain became a glowing rectangle. Ethan pressed the record button. A red dot in the corner of the screen confirmed it was rolling. A sound drifted from the chemist's window. Faint music. It was classical, but not the kind played on the radio. It was complex, atonal, with sharp transitions and dissonances. Bartok, maybe? Or Schoenberg? The sound was barely audible, but in the dead silence of the November courtyard, it seemed loud. He sat perfectly still, holding the phone with both hands to minimize any shaking. The recording was active. He was documenting the event. This was the beginning of the show, the one promised in Eleanor Vance's final entry. The light in his own living room flickered. Ethan flinched but kept the phone steady. The lamp on the ceiling flickered again. Once. Twice. And then it went out. Darkness fell instantly, absolute and impenetrable. At the same moment, the music from across the courtyard stopped. The silence became a physical weight, pressing on his eardrums. He was frozen. His eyes saw nothing. Only the faint rectangle of his phone's screen glowed in the dark, its camera now recording pure blackness. The panic he had so carefully suppressed for the last 2 hours finally broke free. He leaped to his feet. The phone slipped from his sweaty palms. The sound of its fall, a dull thud of plastic against wood, seemed deafening. He heard it hit the parquet and skid away. Damn it! He dropped to his knees, stretching his hands out in front of him. His fingers found only the cold, perfectly smooth floor. He began to crawl, feeling his way through the darkness. Nothing. He moved forward on his knees and slammed his shin into the sharp corner of the coffee table. Pain shot through his leg. God damn it! He froze, clutching the bruised area. The pain throbbed in time with his racing heart. His disorientation was absolute. He couldn't see a thing. There wasn't even a faint glow from the window. A November night in New York was as black as the inside of this apartment. He forced himself to calm down. Breathe. Think. The phone had fallen to the left of the chair. It had skidded across the floor. Judging by the sound, it had gone under the sofa. He turned in the darkness, relying on memory, and crawled toward where he thought the sofa was. His hands found a wooden leg. He lay on his stomach and reached under the furniture. Dust. His fingers brushed against something soft, like a spider web. No, not a spider web. Just dust. But there shouldn't be any dust. Eleanor Vance's apartment was sterile. The thought flickered and vanished, replaced by the urgent need to find his phone. He stretched further, his shoulder pressing against the base of the sofa. His fingers touched something smooth and hard. The phone. He grabbed it, pulled his arm back, and rolled onto his back, breathing heavily. The screen was dark. He pressed the power button. Nothing. He pressed it again, holding it down. The screen lit up with a logo. The phone was rebooting from the impact. He waited, lying on the cold floor, staring at the screen like a drowning man at a life raft. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Finally, the lock screen appeared. With trembling fingers, he unlocked the phone and switched on the flashlight. A bright, cold beam of light shot out, cutting through the darkness. He slowly rose to his knees, aiming the light ahead. The circle of light slid across the floor. The parquet was immaculate, not a speck of dust, not a mote of dirt. He frowned. A moment ago, his hand had been covered in dust from under the sofa. He remembered it clearly. He aimed the flashlight under the sofa again. The floor beneath the furniture was pristine, polished as if it had been cleaned just yesterday. No dust. He slowly got to his feet. The beam of the flashlight swept across the wall, over the spines of the books on the shelves, and then it stopped. Standing in the doorway to the hallway was a man. Ethan froze, his heart skipping a beat. The man stood perfectly still, as if he had been there all along, simply dissolved in the darkness. He was middle-aged, wearing a dark green sweater and gray trousers. His face was ordinary, forgettable. No scars, no moles, no distinguishing features. He didn't look threatening. But his presence in this locked apartment was a silent scream of terror. Ethan shone the light directly in his face. The man squinted, but didn't raise a hand to shield his eyes. He just stood there, watching. His gaze was calm, almost sympathetic. The silence stretched. Ethan couldn't breathe, couldn't move. His finger was clamped so tightly on the flashlight button that his knuckles had turned white. Finally, the man in the doorway spoke. His voice was quiet, even, devoid of threat or emotion, which made it all the more terrifying. You shouldn't have drunk the water. 4 words. They crashed down on Ethan like an avalanche. The water. The glass in the kitchen. He had drunk it without a second thought. The reagents are unstable. The chemist. Poison. The connections snapped into place in his mind with horrifying clarity. This wasn't a burglar. This wasn't a random intruder. It was him, the subject from the notebook. The chemist. And he, Ethan, was poisoned. A chill spread through his body, starting from the back of his neck. His hands went numb. The flashlight beam trembled, dancing across the walls. He glanced down at his own hands, expecting to see them shaking, convulsing, showing the first signs of the poison. His skin was pale, slick with sweat. But his hands weren't trembling. Not yet. He looked back at the man in the doorway. He was still standing there, motionless. Waiting. Primal, uncontrollable self-preservation exploded in Ethan's chest. Run. Now. Immediately. He spun around and bolted for the front door. The flashlight beam careened off the hallway walls, turning the space into a kaleidoscope of shadows. The mirror in its dark frame reflected his contorted, terrified face. He slammed into the door with his full body weight. His hands scrambled frantically for the lock, the deadbolt, the chain. He had secured them all himself just hours ago, methodically, in order. First the bottom lock, then the top, then the deadbolt, then the chain. Now they felt alien. His fingers slid uselessly over the metal. He yanked at the chain. It held fast. "Open!" he hissed through clenched teeth. "Open, damn you!" He shone the flashlight on the lock, trying to see the mechanism. The top lock. The key was in the keyhole on the other side. He grabbed the knob and tried to turn it. It wouldn't move. Jammed. Or blocked from the other side. Panic flooded his mind, washing away the last remnants of logic. He was trapped. Poisoned. And his murderer was standing somewhere in the darkness behind him. He pressed his forehead against the cold wood of the door and squeezed his eyes shut. His breath came in ragged gasps. The silence of the apartment pressed down on him like a physical weight. And in that silence, he heard a sound. Quiet, slow, footsteps. Someone was walking down the hallway. Toward him. The footsteps were slow, measured, approaching. Ethan pushed himself away from the door and turned to face the darkness of the hallway. The flashlight beam darted across the walls, snatching fragments of reality. The mirror. The coat rack. Emptiness. The footsteps continued, unhurried, relentless, approaching with the inevitability of a pendulum. Something inside him finally broke. Logic, control, calculation, it all evaporated, leaving only primal terror. He scrambled down the hallway, away from the sound. His legs felt weak, his body refusing to obey. He slammed his shoulder into a wall, pushed off, and kept going. The flashlight beam jumped from the floor to the ceiling, creating a chaotic dance of shadows. He stumbled into the living room and tripped over the leg of the coffee table. He went down hard, his knees slamming into the unyielding floor. The phone flew from his hand, tumbling away. The flashlight went out. Darkness swallowed him whole. Ethan lay on the floor, gasping for air, his lungs burning as if he had inhaled fire. His heart hammered against his ribs, threatening to burst through his chest. The footsteps stopped. Silence returned, heavy and absolute. He strained his ears, holding his breath, but heard nothing, only the frantic thumping of his own pulse. Seconds stretched into minutes. Slowly, Ethan lifted his head. The darkness was total. He couldn't see his own hand in front of his face. Then a voice spoke from the void. "The locks aren't the problem, Ethan." The voice was quiet, calm, emanating from somewhere in the dark living room. It wasn't approaching. It was simply present. "You are the problem." Ethan froze, pressing himself against the parquet floor, every muscle coiled tight. "You're trying to find a logical exit from an illogical situation," the voice continued, its tone measured, almost like a teacher explaining a simple concept to a slow child. "You're trying to apply rules to a game where no rules exist. You lost the moment you decided to stay." The words rained down on him like stones, each one striking a vulnerability in his rational world. He opened his mouth to scream, to argue, to say anything, but only a weak, strangled wheeze escaped his throat. Poison. He had drunk the poison. The realization exploded in his mind with a blinding flash of panic. The water. The glass in the kitchen. He had drained it without thinking. Reagents are unstable. His body reacted instantly to the suggestion. A wave of weakness washed over him, and his limbs gave way. He collapsed face first onto the floor, the cold wood pressing against his cheek. His legs went numb. His fingers refused to obey. This was the end. He was dying here, in the dark, in a dead woman's apartment, killed by a ghost he had summoned himself. His breathing became shallow and ragged. Consciousness began to blur at the edges, fading into a gray mist. The last thing he heard was silence, ringing, empty, and absolute. The chemist had vanished. Time lost its meaning as Ethan drifted into nothingness. Ethan lay on the floor, staring into the blackness. How much time had passed? A minute? An hour? He was breathing, slow, heavy breaths, but he was breathing. The fingers on his right hand twitched, then his left. The weakness was receding, leaving behind a violent tremor and a layer of cold, sticky sweat. He wasn't dead. The thought pierced the fog of shock. He was not dead. If the chemist had poisoned the water, the symptoms should have escalated, not vanished. It was illogical. The words stuck in his brain like a splinter. Illogical. A real killer would have finished the job, not walked away, leaving the victim alive on the floor. An anomaly. It was the first crack in the nightmare's construction. Ethan slowly rolled onto his back. The ceiling was lost in the shadows, but he knew it was there. Just as he knew, with sudden clarity, that the room was empty. The chemist was gone. Or perhaps he had never been there at all. The thought was absurd, but it hooked into his mind and wouldn't let go. He forced himself onto his hands and knees. His arms shook, but they held him. He had to go back to the source data, to the notebook. It was the last thing he could do as an appraiser, as an analyst. Gather facts, test the hypothesis, find the error in the equation. He crawled across the floor, sweeping his hand through the dark until his fingers hit the smooth surface of his phone. He grabbed it and pressed the button. The screen flared to life and he toggled the flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom. The circle of light revealed a patch of parquet, a sofa leg, and a few feet away, the notebook with the ochre cover. He crawled to it and picked it up with trembling hands. He opened it. But now he read it differently, not as a victim, but as an investigator. Section. Subject. The Chemist. September 10th, 0742. Subject left the apartment. Gray coat, black briefcase. Ethan turned the page slowly. September 14th, 0803. Subject smoking near the entrance. Unfiltered cigarettes. 3 in 11 minutes. Ethan frowned. He didn't smoke unfiltered cigarettes. He didn't smoke at all. He read the next entry. September 22nd, 2147. Subject listening to music via headphones by the window. Atonal classical, presumably Schoenberg. Habit, every night exactly at 10 p.m. A chill crawled up his spine. He had Schoenberg on a playlist for concentration, but he didn't listen to it every night. He frantically flipped back to the beginning of the section, and there he saw what he had missed in his initial panicked reading. The date of the first entry was September 10th. Today was November 8th. 2 months ago. But he had only arrived at this apartment for the first time today. How could Eleanor Vance have observed him 2 months ago? The answer was singular and unavoidable. She couldn't. Ethan flipped the pages back to the very beginning, past the meteorological data. His hands shook so hard he nearly tore the paper. On the very first page, written in that impeccable script, was a title he had skipped in his haste. Subject number 12. The Appraiser. Preliminary Analysis of Behavioral Patterns in Professional Representatives. It didn't say the chemist. It said the appraiser. Everything. Every entry. Every obsessive detail. It was all about a type, an archetype, a psychological profile of the real estate appraisers who frequented the building. Eleanor Vance had been collecting data on the behavior of people in his profession. She watched them come and go, recording their common traits: methodical nature, caution, fear of chaos, love of order. And Ethan, reading these notes, had projected himself into them. He had recognized himself in the description of a generalized subject. The chemist never existed. It was a pseudonym, a code she used to designate someone else, perhaps a real pharmacist, she observed. But Ethan, in his fear of the irrational, had given that code a body and a face. He had created the monster himself. The experiment has spun out of control. The reagents are unstable. He closed the notebook and pressed it against his forehead. The reagents were information. Words. The entries in this cursed diary. And the experiment was his own mind, which had failed to withstand the collision with the mirror of its own fears. There was no poison, only suggestion. A psychosomatic reaction to words spoken by his own fevered imagination. The figure with binoculars in the window opposite was a hallucination born of paranoia. The silhouette in the doorway was a shadow he had given shape. The voice in the dark was the echo of his own unraveling sanity. Ethan stood up slowly. His legs were weak, but they supported him. He no longer feared the shadows. He knew who the real monster was. The flashlight beam illuminated the path to the hallway. He walked slowly, methodically, just as he had walked through hundreds of properties before. A professional inspection, a final valuation. He stopped in front of the large mirror in the dark frame. He raised the phone and aimed the harsh light at his own face. A stranger stared back from the glass. His hair was wild, standing up in all directions. His face was pale, covered in sweat and grime. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, radiating a latent madness. A bleeding gash on his forehead, one he didn't remember receiving, stood out against the pallor. His tie was torn. His pristine shirt was wrinkled and stained. This was not a confident professional. This was not a cold analyst. This was a broken man. A structure that had suffered catastrophic failure. Ethan looked at the reflection for a long time, unblinking. He studied it with the same clinical detachment he used to study cracks in foundations, wear on floorboards, or the quality of fixtures. A professional appraisal. Cold, precise, impartial. He saw the damage. He registered the defects. He noted the critical failures in the load-bearing beams of his personality. The system had collapsed. Control was lost irretrievably. Ethan's lips curled into a semblance of a smile. There was no joy in it, not even bitterness, only professionalism. He was delivering a verdict, the final report, the ultimate valuation of the most complex property of his career. His voice was quiet, flat, devoid of any human emotion. It was the voice of an appraiser issuing a condemnation order. Property is beyond repair. Total loss. The words hung in the stale air. No echo returned. The silence of the apartment accepted the sentence and dissolved it into the gloom. Ethan kept watching the mirror, watching the ruins of who he had been, the debris of the system he had meticulously built over 35 years. The notebook slipped from his hand and hit the floor with a dull thud. The flashlight beam began to flicker, losing strength. The battery was dying. But Ethan didn't move. He stood there in the dark hallway of a dead woman's home, staring into the eyes of his own reflection. Appraiser and subject. Hunter and prey. One face. The phone screen went black. Darkness swallowed them both.